Hi there, everybody. My name is Rob Buscher, and I'm with the Tadaima Virtual Pilgrimage. I'm also representing the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival as the board chair. And I'm joined today with Jason Matsumoto.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jason Matsumoto. I'm the co-founder of Full Spectrum Features and also on the film committee for the Virtual Pilgrimage. Just very happy to be here and very excited to hear and learn more from Rob Buscher about propaganda.
So today's conversation is going to largely focus on the role that Hollywood played in crafting and disseminating propaganda during the Second World War related to anti-Japanese and anti-Japanese American narrative. Basically, this week and several weeks to come, we are showing propaganda films as part of the film festival, not necessarily for their merit as films, but certainly as historical texts. And I think it's important that we kind of look at this from the perspective that, so many people who were watching these during the Second World War were taking them at face value. So while they may seem incredibly offensive, as many of them are, certainly, it's an important historical resource for us to be able to understand better the lived experiences of people during that conflict, and I think in some ways contextualize why our community suffered to the extent that it did during that war. So the format of today's discussion, I'm actually going to be presenting a brief presentation for about maybe 20, 25 minutes, sort of contextualizing propaganda in general, talking a little bit about some of the propaganda narratives that were very popular during the Second World War. And then we're going to kind of open it up into more of a discussion really about the propaganda clips and films that we'll be showing throughout the course of this week and weeks to come. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and get into the presentation. All right. So I should mention briefly, I lecture at the University of Pennsylvania's Asian American Studies program. A lot of this work that I'll be presenting today is part of the research that I do there in my two courses on Asian American cinema and Asian American activism. I think it's important for us to kind of start by defining propaganda so that we have a shared definition. And basically, this is a lot of different ways to categorize and understand propaganda. It's not as cut and dry as simply seeing a wartime poster that has a bad word on it. It goes a lot deeper than that, and I think it becomes a lot more dubious the further removed it gets from the context of a propaganda poster. People don't often realize that things like rhetoric or the way that a politician speaks can be propagandist. Literature, visual art, music, architecture, and of course film and TV all have the potential to share biased and one-sided information and promote their point of view with the exclusion of a counterpoint. When we're kind of looking at the propaganda from the perspective that we are today, this is really related to World War II, but in general, you can see how a lot of propaganda is based on systems of control and also established stereotypes or norms, in the sense that it relies on people misunderstanding or having preconceived notions of a variety of subjects, using those notions to then play on their emotion and make them feel or think in a certain way. So there's a lot of different ways that propaganda can do this, but most often we see the reduction of complex concepts into simple dichotomies, as in good and evil or black and white. And obviously in this world, and certainly in wartime, there's no such thing as clear-cut yes or no. There's always gray area, there's always nuance. And so an effective piece of propaganda will obscure that conversation and use emotion to invoke those kinds of responses so that someone will wholeheartedly support whichever line of thinking. I wanted to kind of start by thinking a little bit about how propaganda has played in other historical conflicts that the United States has been involved in. I think the Spanish-American War is a particularly good example. For those of you who haven't taken a US history course in a while, a quick refresher. At this point, the Spanish Empire had really waned and had spread themselves too thin. There were successive waves of revolutions that swept across Central and South America for the past 60 years or so. And at this point, it was on its last leg. And increasingly, the United States was showing interest in some of their colonial possessions in the Caribbean, including Cuba and Puerto Rico. There was tension because the Cubans were starting to revolt against the Spanish Empire. And at the time, the United States was not directly involved in a military conflict, but they were supplying some supplies to the rebels. And obviously, this is a bad thing for the Spanish. Unrelated to that, there is an American naval ship, the USS Maine, that was docked in port there, and it was believed to have some supplies that they were giving to rebels. The entire ship went up in flame and exploded. And in the many decades since, a number of historians and naval scholars have been able to confirm this almost definitely happened because of an accident where essentially faulty wiring led to a spark in the engine room, which then ignited a powder keg and blew up the hull of the ship. Well, at the time, without any evidence to substantiate this, the popular press, including the Hearst and Pulitzer newspapers, syndicated newspapers across the country that together made up the largest readership in the country, basically were having a circulation war and trying to outdo each other with the titles that they had. And so during this time period, very little sourcing was done to make sure that this was correct information. And both newspapers began to theorize that the Spanish had a role in this. Well, their inflammatory headlines caused the United States public to demand Congress declare war on Spain, and ultimately it did. Very quickly led to enacting a war which lasted only 10 weeks. And at the end of this conflict, the United States was able to acquire a number of territories, including the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and while Cuba was a free state, certainly extended their sphere of influence to it. So this is relevant for us in a couple ways. One, because obviously the headlines of newspapers in World War II were extremely inflammatory, both in terms of creating this narrative of Japanese Americans being potential enemy spies, but then also, making it seem as if it wasn't as bad for the people that were being sent to incarceration camps. But the other important piece for our conversation today is how film played a role in this. A lot of people probably know Edison as an inventor, and certainly Edison is synonymous with General Electrics and the light bulb, a number of other important inventions. He was also an early filmmaker. Not many people know that. And in the early weeks of the Battleship Maine being wrecked, the documentary newsreels that were created by the Thomas Edison Company began to circulate widely throughout the United States wherever films were shown. And I want to show you a couple of clips here to just demonstrate how a propaganda narrative can work within the context of even a very rudimentary silent film like this. So this is a silent film. It's shown in its original format without sound, and I will speak over it so that we can kind of continue our conversation here. What we're looking at is the wreckage of the USS Maine being dragged through the harbor in Havana on its way back into the United States. The idea of creating some sort of emotional connection to the USS Maine is very important here, because it's also something that we'll see within some of the earliest propaganda footage from World War II. If you recall the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the way in which United States military and its personnel are sort of embodied by the USS Arizona is very similar to how the USS Maine is being seen in this particular news clip, but also in the rhetoric that the newspapers were engaging in. So that's the first clip. Now I want to show you another clip, which was released in the same day and the same week, which is called The Burial of the Maine Victims. And this was a highly sensationalized national funeral, probably the last funeral of such importance that I'm aware of was the Lincoln funeral, because of the pomp and circumstance that was given, and, as well as the widespread news coverage. But here we have a burial procession for the victims of the USS Maine explosion. And again, these two clips would be shown back to back and associating and reinforcing that idea that the Maine is part of this story, and really the death of these soldiers and the destruction of the USS Maine are one and the same in the eyes of the audience. Skipping ahead to another clip, it was released 2 months later in June of 1898. It's actually a troop shipment on its way to the Philippines. And by the time that this was coming out, the United States had declared war on Spain and had already, in some ways, assured its victory. Philippines was not a place of strategic importance in the Spanish-American conflict, yet the United States sort of used this opportunity to take this territory for their own. And we know, as all students of history, that after the Spanish-American War was over, although the United States military was working alongside the Filipino rebels to declare independence against the Spanish, they signed an armistice with the Spaniards that included the colonial possession of the Philippines to the United States. So when we kind of look at the context of all three of these clips together, it creates a really complete narrative that essentially demonstrates the cause and effect of first, the USS Maine being destroyed, second, the burial of the victims, and third, here's the causality that we are now going to see our victorious troops march off to the Philippines, and the Spaniards and later the Filipinos will suffer because of it, obscuring the fact that, again, the USS Maine was an accident, and the United States did not have good reason to be fighting in that conflict in the Philippines, aside from territorial possession. So the results of that, and just to kind of close the loop on the Philippine story, United States becomes, for the first time, a global superpower. We can see this cartoon from the Philadelphia Press, a precursor to the Philadelphia Inquirer, showing the American empire 10,000 miles from tip to tip as the eagle spreads from Puerto Rico to Manila in the Philippines. And it's important to kind of contextualize that as well, because I think when we talk about World War II from the American standpoint, it's very often a story that begins with Pearl Harbor. We have to understand that the United States was one of many empires that was active in territorial acquisition across the Pacific. And this map really demonstrates the extent of that. You'll note how far Hawaii is from the other territorial possessions that the United States possessed. You'll also note that the red territories, which are the Japanese territories, extend well into the American naval space. And so, when we start to understand the Pacific War in this context, it makes more sense than simply a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. We start to understand that these are two competing empires that are both seeking to expand their territory in the Pacific. And ultimately, like all empires throughout this age of empires, all of them came into conflict at one point or another with each other. So it's a matter of time for this to happen in the US and Japan context. And again, for some more context, looking at how far and how quickly this changed, because that last image that we're looking at is in 1939 on the eve of World War II. And here we are in 1942 at the extent of the Japanese Empire at its largest. And so many of these territories that had belonged to other European and American powers were now in the hands of the Japanese Empire. So switching over to this conversation of anti-Japanese propaganda, I think it's important to note that propaganda existed on all fronts of World War II. There was anti-American propaganda in Japan. There was anti-Nazi and anti-fascist Italian propaganda in the US. But when you kind of compare the way in which Italian fascists or Nazi Germans were being portrayed, although they might have been beastly, they never approached on this kind of dehumanized perspective that we see so clearly in a lot of the anti-Japanese propaganda. There's very much effort to play up the racial differences. We can kind of see how the Japanese soldier gets racialized very early on in so many of these propaganda cartoons, particularly in illustrations, but then also in motion pictures, which we'll be kind of talking about a little bit later here. When you think about the point of dehumanizing a person, and I think this is a really important point to stress, I would like to think that the hardest thing to do as a soldier is to take the life of another human being. And if you can convince your soldiers that the people on the other end of their gun are less human than they are, I think it becomes a little bit easier to pull that trigger. And from my perspective, that's essentially what this propaganda is doing. It's dehumanizing the Japanese soldier to make it easier for the American soldier to then say, you know, we can go and we can kill these people. And you know, realistically, that's something that extends even earlier in American history. And I think it's important for us to kind of think about how some of the anti-Chinese sentiment that extended from the 1860s until, you know, well into the 20th century set the stage for some of the anti-Japanese propaganda that we see in the way that people are being racialized, the kind of large buck teeth and the slanted eyes that we see in a lot of these cartoons. And in a more direct example, we're looking at two images side by side. On the left hand, a trade card from the Victorian era advertising the peerless mechanical laundry wringer. The laundry industry invested heavily in anti-Chinese propaganda because Chinese people in the United States were associated with this laundry business. And the underlying context of their propaganda was that if you buy from us, then you don't have a reason for the Chinese to be here anymore. So it's sort of based on this racism that existed at that time period. The reason I show these images side by side is because essentially we're seeing the same kind of violent image playing out from the year 1882 on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we see General Tojo being dragged through a laundry wringer by an American soldier in 1942. A 60-year time frame, and yet somehow this same image of violence persists. So, you know, it's important to think about the context of that within pre-war years. And obviously we understand that the Issei and older Nisei faced quite a bit of prejudice on the West Coast, even before World War II began. And this kind of contextualizes a little bit about, you know, how that shift could be made into wartime propaganda. I guess one of the more troubling things for me, looking at this kind of propaganda, is how often the imagery of Uncle Sam, you know, the epitome personification of the United States, is shown committing violent acts against Japanese people. And again, in the context of a wartime conflict, we can understand why this would be necessary, but there's never any distinction being made between Japanese and Japanese Americans. And obviously, for those of us who have family that were either forcibly removed or incarcerated in World War II, we do know that this racism kind of bled over into our community. And I think particularly on that note, thinking about how prominent the home front propaganda was about not just racializing Japanese as foreign others, but having some kind of violence being perpetrated against them. And you know, the slap a Jap cards or the Jap hunting license that we see on the screen here are just two examples of many others that were associated with defense bond trading as well as the savings bonds for wartime conflict, showing that you're a good American if you're spending on the defense stamps, but also agreeing that there's some violence that should happen, and not making that distinction between a Japanese and a Japanese American. In other examples of propaganda, we can see even more clearly, not only is there no distinction being made between the Empire of Japan and Japanese Americans, some people are actively leaning into it, as we see here in these two Dr. Seuss cartoons. Better known at the time, I guess, as Theodore Geisel. He was a political cartoonist that worked in several newspapers. These are both from the PM Daily, a New York-based daily newspaper that ran throughout the 1940s. And this idea that Japanese Americans were essentially enemy spies was something that had been propagated by the news media for almost a decade prior to Pearl Harbor being bombed. It played into that racially based narrative where you had a lot of white nativist farmers in California who begrudged the Japanese their success in the farming industry. And this narrative kind of conspired along the national trend in the early weeks and months of the war, particularly here in the cartoon on the right-hand side. We see a line of Japanese Americans who are lining up from Washington to Oregon to California, waiting in line for their bundle of TNT at a little shack that says the Honorable Fifth Column, and waiting for a signal from home. So these are really dangerous images when we consider how they're being linked into the other conversation that's happening at the same time. And if the distinction had been made between Japanese Americans being American, I imagine there still would have been animosity. But on top of that, you have people who are actively trying to suggest and insinuate that there is a reason why we need to fear Japanese persons for the reasons that are suggested here in these cartoons. To make matters worse, United States government obviously during World War II issued a number of different propaganda films, and we'll kind of get into more of that during our discussion here. But there's a number of films that we'll be showing both this week and in weeks to come, such as Japanese Americans, or a collection of newsreels about the 442nd that seek to euphemize and also make things a little bit easier to understand for the American public, suggesting that the incarceration was a necessary protection for Japanese Americans. This kind of narrative that people are being placed into camps for their safety, or that this is a necessary sacrifice in a time of war. Well-worn narratives that are rooted in this kind of propaganda. And unfortunately, for many people who only study history in the context of the American public school system, these are the same kind of narratives that are still being taught today. One of the most difficult things to talk about with relation to anti-Japanese propaganda in World War II is the real impact and success that it had on totally dehumanizing Japanese soldiers. And I know these images are difficult to look at, but these were all printed in Life magazine and other mainstream news publications during World War II. There was this practice of trophy hunting that took place in the Pacific Front of World War II that really didn't happen. If it did happen in the European front, it was a very small number of corpses that were identified as this. But we have documentation to suggest that about 60% of all of the Japanese corpses on Guadalcanal were found decapitated, largely because of the practice of trophy hunting and taking home souvenirs of body parts of the Japanese soldier. Obviously, people who are doing this did not view them as human. And that's the extent to which we're kind of seeing the effectiveness of propaganda at this time period, and why it's so important to understand that this goes beyond hurt feelings or property loss or the injustices that our community faced here in the United States. It also has an incredibly negative impact on the ways in which the war was being fought in the Pacific. I think this image here from August 9th, 1945 issue of Life magazine, to me, really summarizes the reality of how normalized it became for violence against Japanese by the end of World War II. This is a frame-by-frame depiction of a Japanese soldier being burned out of a like a pillbox by an Australian soldier with a flamethrower, literally as he burns to death. And on the opposite page, we see an ad for Campbell's mushroom soup. Can you imagine in 1945 having this magazine on your coffee table, reading this article and thinking, what's for dinner? But that's kind of the extent of how normalized and omnipresent that anti-Japanese propaganda had become by the end of the war. So I just want to quickly go through a little bit of the background on the role of Hollywood films in kind of constructing some of these narratives. And then we're going to spend the rest of our time here in discussion with Jason about this. But one of the things that I find very interesting about World War II cinema, the Pacific Front of World War II is the single most documented topic within all of American war cinema. In fact, there's at least 2 films per major battle or campaign in this conflict. And again, this doesn't happen just during World War II. I mean, we're talking about from 1941 to 1991, about 180 films were produced by Hollywood studios on this subject. So, you know, the reality that this topic is kind of being kept alive for future generations, and the kind of animosity felt against Japan continued to be brought up alongside other anti-Japanese sentiments, trade wars, 1980s decline of the manufacturing industry, the United States, and the rise of the Japanese automobile import has the potential for long-lasting and continuing impacts in terms of anti-Japanese sentiment. But you know, in the war years especially, there were so many narrative films that came out from Hollywood that the Office of War Information helped to create by giving script suggestions or topics, access to footage. One in particular that I wanted to highlight here is Little Tokyo, USA. It's actually the very last film that's featured in the clips that are accessible now this week. And it essentially creates this false narrative that all of Little Tokyo, Los Angeles was conspiring against the United States, and that's why Pearl Harbor happened. And this film was released by 20th Century Fox less than 5 months after Pearl Harbor. So you can imagine the potential impact and the real impact that this had on how American people understood the role of Japanese Americans. One of the other interesting side notes is that while there were no Japanese American actors left in Hollywood because of the forced removal, there were other Asian American actors and actresses. And a lot of the folks that we might still remember today, Philip Ahn, Richard Liu, Anna May Wong, they all had roles at this time period. And I think in the end, a lot of them did actually regret it afterwards, because they realized that even though at the time their ancestral countries of origin may have been at war with Japan, the impact of stereotyping Japanese in the war years would continue to impact not just the Japanese Americans, but also other East Asian Americans. Cartoons played another major role in how the propaganda narrative was spread, and actually all 5 of the cartoons listed on this slide are part of the clip reel. So if you haven't already watched it, you can actually see clips from it yourself and better understand how these messages were being delivered to younger audiences. Of course, cartoons were seen by all audiences in those days, since there were no children-specific screenings. Oftentimes a feature film would be shown with a couple of newsreels and perhaps a cartoon or 2 before the feature. And they're definitely multi-layered in that respect, but the depictions of Japanese and the attitudes towards Japanese sabotage, for example, is very crudely depicted, as we can kind of see in the two stills here to the right-hand side. And, just to kind of close the loop on this idea that I had mentioned earlier, anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States doesn't end in 1945, right? The war ends, but there's no real concerted effort to repair the damage that's been done by all this negative propaganda. And as we see from the 1970s through the 90s, when the trade wars were happening with US and Japan, and the decline of the manufacturing industry, this only further exacerbated the sort of anti-Japanese sentiment, which then is actually playing up a lot of the old World War II rationale, things like Pearl Harbor 2, Buy American Before It's Too Late. We see what's meant to be a Mitsubishi Zero fighter, the same plane that was used in the bombing of Pearl Harbor, dropping automobiles and consumer electronics over the United States. So, these kinds of narratives, unfortunately, have continued to stay with our community well into today. And the last thing that I wanted to share was that, unfortunately, it doesn't end with our community either. And the same tactics that have been used against the Japanese American community are being used currently against other communities of color and other immigrant groups today. And I think it's important for us to kind of think about that. And as someone who has spent a considerable amount of time looking at history, we do start to see these parallels. And I think so many of our community members have, and that's why our community does have a large voice in allyship and advocacy for other communities. But by learning more about propaganda, hopefully you can also start to identify the aspects of contemporary propaganda that are around us, so that we can kind of move away from that and hopefully change the conversation into something more positive. So thank you, everyone, for bearing with us as we kind of got through the presentation part of the this presentation. And now I'm going to open it up for Jason and I to have a conversation. There's also a live chat function on YouTube. For those of you who are watching us there, feel free to type in questions into the comment box, and we'll do our best to get to them.
Cool. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for the presentation. I just wanted to really quickly ask you, because it seems like there's like a really strong connection between what you teach at UPenn through your Asian American studies, focusing on activism and history. And then as we were preparing for this, you mentioned to me that you actually collect a lot of this memorabilia yourself. And I was just curious kind of like how you came to kind of focus on propaganda specifically. I mean, you also are doing a lot of stuff with the Philadelphia Asian American Film Fest, which is thinking about like moving images and the impact of that. I wonder kind of, can you explain how all this kind of came together and what prompted you to both put this presentation together, but then also put this Hollywood at War video together too? I think it's just a really great piece that kind of brings all of this imagery together for us.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Jason. And I think to give a little bit more context, a lot of the work that I do professionally and personally kind of stems from experiences that I had growing up when, I, as a mixed race Japanese American growing up in rural suburban Connecticut, it wasn't a good thing to be Japanese, unfortunately. And I think it took a long time for me to understand that the things that made me different from my peers were actually the strengths that I had. So as I got a little older and I started to kind of delve into that, and it was odd to me that in the 1980s and 90s, like 40, 50 years after the end of World War II, that there would be such animosity towards Japanese people.
Mm-hmm.
I needed to understand why that was. And it kind of led me down this, up to this point, like 15-year rabbit hole of trying to understand how media and popular culture has shifted the way that Americans understand not just Japanese and Japanese Americans, but really all topics, and how much of a role that film and television plays in the understanding that everyday people have on a variety of different issues. So I think the purpose of showing these kinds of anti-Japanese propaganda pieces is really to uproot that history and say, when people try to suggest that the incarceration wasn't as bad as, all that, or that in some ways Japanese Americans were justified in having this happen to them, which are things that we see and hear today, right? And there's still people in public education systems, certainly in the news media, who have argued that. We've seen elected officials make statements similar to that. And it's important to be able to pull out these artifacts and say, here is a tangible piece of history that comes from 1942 that shows the reality of why our families were forced to endure what they did. And, I think that that's been especially important in the last 4 years or so, when this narrative around fake news and alternative facts started to become part of the mainstream political discourse. There's a real need to be able to present these kinds of artifacts, and hopefully people will be less likely to argue against these things when they can see it with their own eyes. And that's certainly been a large part of the reason behind collecting, because I know the first time that I saw an anti-Japanese propaganda poster, this was in, I think, 2016. My wife and I antique, and we walked into an antique show at the Kimmel Center, the orchestra hall in Philadelphia. And from across the room, I saw this awful, 1944 poster that showed the flaming face of a Japanese soldier. And it said in big letters, "Factory fires help the Japs." And it was just such a visceral reaction that I had to it. It felt like I got punched in the stomach. And, for somebody who's studied this their whole life, and obviously has family history with it, I could only imagine then what an 18-year-old college kid would say if they saw it. And so I bought it on the spot, and since then have just been collecting other pieces, and I use them as classroom teaching resources. And it again seems like a strange thing to do for somebody who's involved with civil rights and positive portrayals of Asian Americans in film and television, but it's part of our history, and we need to kind of understand that part if we're going to overcome it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I mean, for me, I was just really curious too, in your research, one thing as you were going through the presentation was there was a moment in time where all this just felt like normal advertising to us. And, what, in your mind, when you look back at these things, there's some level of construction that's happening. There's some level of really trying to manage the message. Can you talk a little bit about how you see, there's all these things happening. There's all these different pieces and different publications. There's different news media outlets. But there's a very similar message happening. How do you think that happens across all these disparate outlets?
Yeah, and it's interesting you should say that, because in some ways I do think it's organic, right? Because once you start setting a media agenda by repeating the same phrase often enough, that's just how people start talking about a subject. And one of the first pieces out of the gates was actually the attack on Pearl Harbor newsreel, which is part of the video that I edited together for this week's discussion. And it demonstrates how even within the first 2 or 3 weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, we're already hearing things like sneak attack, treachery, cowardice, stabbed in the back. And I mean, these are the words that will be used to frame the conversation for the duration of World War II. It's not by accident, certainly. And, when the United States Office of War Information was created, it was created with the express purpose of managing the propaganda narrative. I mean, that was blatantly made public at that time period. People knew that that's what the Office of War Information did. So to an extent, I think people may have been aware that this is, coming from the government, and so it's going to be slanted. But at the same time, they might not have been aware of the role that the OWI had in approving scripts in Hollywood for fictional narrative films, or the role that they played in making sure that certain high-profile animation studios like Disney or Warner Brothers were being incentivized to include anti-Japanese messages in their cartoons. Because I think, we start to see those aspects of culture that reflect the anti-Japanese sentiment. And it's not necessarily clear to the consumer to what extent is being directed by the government. In other cases too, I think we have to kind of think about it from the capitalist standpoint. I mean, while many of the individuals who were creating these propaganda pieces were doing so out of patriotism, there were also people that were profiteering from it. And when we look at the integration of anti-Japanese sentiment into advertising in particular, I think that we really see a lot of that in ways that, have nothing to do with the war effort. And I think a good example of that, I'm actually looking at a postcard right now on my desk. This is from a well-known postcard company called Krups. But basically, it reads, "It won't be long now, so the Japs want a new order, eh? Here it is, ready, aim, fire." And we see this kind of like ghastly characterization of General Tojo. The thing is, this was sent as a regular postcard, right? Like the message on the back has nothing to do with the war effort. I mean, this is just literally someone writing a note to their friend, and this was the postcard that they found, or maybe they thought it was funny and wanted to send it to them. They don't remark on it. So these are these kind of daily reminders that we're at war with Japan. Japanese are bad, and kind of reintegrating these dehumanized, animalistic, demonic images of what Japanese people are.
Yeah, I found it really interesting, like that one image that you talked about from I think it was the Peerless company.
Yeah.
I mean, that to me is like a direct tie. I mean, that was more about like anti-Chinese sentiment, but it's just purely tied to like an economic purpose of like, hey, purchase things or use our company because we have these values, and these values happen to be, trying to rid the country of Chinese people. And then seeing that image again, in 1942, like it's the kind of the proximity of like that, whatever, like business or like economic enterprise endeavor with the messaging around like quote unquote American values or something like that is quite fascinating. I think it still happens today.
Absolutely. I mean, you think about, I guess, like certain conservative brands who have aligned themselves with anti-immigrant messages, and there's definitely some interesting dynamics that we can see in contemporary perspectives. But I think it's also a point that you brought up in your question was this idea of how commercialism can integrate into propaganda narrative in ways that people weren't aware of, but in some ways maybe they were, right? And that if you see a company that is espousing these ideals, that you might be more interested in purchasing from them. And it also kind of reminds me about the economic impacts in general, about how much of the evacuation and forced removal of Japanese Americans was based on the economics, the value of their land, the knowledge that the government wouldn't let the fields fall empty, that they'd be reallocated to white landowners or farmers. And I mean, so much of this conversation is economic. And I think when you follow the money, you start to understand how these things work better.
Yeah. We should jump into kind of like the work that we're both doing today, but there's two questions actually that are coming up, and I'll read them to you. Maybe you don't have like the immediate answer right now, but so the first question is about background information on the film Little Tokyo, USA, and whether or not you know who was behind that, maybe who was the production company or who was backing it, and then the second question is, was it a Hollywood theatrical release for profit? Do you know?
Yeah, thank you, Robert, for that question, and I'm happy to share that information with you. Basically, Little Tokyo USA was one of two films that 20th Century Fox started production on within a week of Pearl Harbor happening. In fact, another film called Secret Agent of Japan, which was released as a companion piece to this film, actually started production on December 8th, 1941. The rationale behind that was that Fox's studio head at the time wanted to be the first studio out of the gates with the anti-Japanese film, knowing that they would clean up at the box office. So absolutely, yes, this was a decision that was made for profit. And the most damning thing about Little Tokyo USA, aside from the premise being just outrageous, that there was a secret spy ring in Little Tokyo, Los Angeles, that somehow orchestrated the bombing of Pearl Harbor. What upsets me so much about that film is that it actually ends with documentary footage of Japanese Americans being evacuated from Little Tokyo, being put onto buses, being sent to an assembly center, and later being relocated into Manzanar. And all of that footage was provided to them by the Office of War Information. So this kind of blending of fictional narrative with fact and the reality that this happened, showing a direct consequence, suggested falsely that there was some sabotage or espionage that was happening. So it was a very dangerous film. To my knowledge, they've sort of disavowed any ownership of it. The film is in public domain. It's very hard to access, but it is out there. And there's clips of it on YouTube. And if you watch the Hollywood at War clip reel that I put together, you can watch the footage that I'm talking about. It's at the very end of that reel.
That scene you're talking about, is that when it shows the buses and then pans back into the room and that woman's explaining why the forced removal was necessary and the right thing to do?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was just like, jaw dropped to the floor when I saw that. I wonder too, in the last answer, you were talking a little bit about, you mentioned kind of this like very direct connection of like even down to like script review from like a federal office into like a scripted narrative film. Is this one of those films?
Yes. So this definitely was reviewed by the Office of War Information. To my knowledge, they didn't create the narrative. The narrative was written by the screenwriter who was in the employment of 20th Century Fox. But anything related to conflict with any of the enemy nations was going through the Office of War Information at that time period.
Cool. One more question from Mike Itamura. He says, how does the number of propaganda films and the way the Japanese are portrayed compare to the number of anti-German films and German portrayal of those films during World War II?
Thanks for the question, Mike, and that's great to bring that up. Again, there's so many films about World War II. It really is the most covered film subject around like conflict films in American cinema. And certainly we're very familiar with the popular movies that came out of the European front of World War II. Anti-German propaganda is more interesting in the sense that for the most part, it was really just Hitler and his inner circle that were being propagandized as evil, right? I mean, we do see some like faceless Nazi soldiers in different war documentaries, Why We Fight series or Know Your Enemy series, which were both productions of the Office of War Information that were made by Hollywood filmmakers, but under the direct guidance of the US government. Those had more direct onus on showcasing both the leadership and the soldiers of the Nazi army. But in terms of the way that they're being portrayed, we never really get to that same level of dehumanization that we do in the very same films. Why We Fight was a series of 5 films. Oftentimes they talk about multiple enemies within the same film. And you can kind of see from one scene to the next when they're talking about how evil Hitler is or Goebbels or Himmler. And then suddenly they start talking about the Japanese soldier as the enemy, the faceless enemy, and copies of the same cloth. It's a really interesting dynamic, and one that you can certainly see in a lot of the advertising propaganda as well. But good to think about how we see Germans being portrayed, because one of the largest ethnic groups of white Americans at that time period in the United States was German, right? And we all know that, with the exception of a couple of thousands German nationals who had direct ties to the Nazi Party or were funding in some capacity, that there was no German American incarceration camp, right? So this whole construct of racial propaganda, it's really, that's what it is. Japanese soldiers, Japanese people, and Japanese Americans by association were racialized as an enemy race. And that couldn't happen to German Americans, because one, there were so many of them, but also German Americans assimilated into that white American identity in a way that Asian Americans of any ethnicity have not been successful in doing. So I think that's part of the problem that you're identifying there.
Yeah, cool. Thanks again for those questions, Robert and Mike. So I wanted to jump back into kind of the work that both of us are doing now in kind of the film world. You're very connected to the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival, and I'm here in Chicago running a film production and distribution company. And I wonder, Rob, maybe you start out, like, where do you see the connection between your work at, for the Asian American Film Festival and your interest in kind of film and especially curating film, right? Where do you see the connection between that and kind of what stories and narratives this propaganda has like created around our community, around Japanese people, around the war?
I think, as a historian, I tend to think of things chronologically, and without understanding how it got as bad as it did for Japanese Americans and other Asian Americans, I don't feel like I would be properly equipped to address those issues and correct them in the work that I do now. If we can acknowledge that Asian Americans are shown unequal to other ethnicities in the United States, both in like the number of representation as well as negative stereotyping, that had to come from somewhere. And a lot of it did actually come from World War II. And that was kind of one of the other layers that I kind of peeled back and started to understand, even before this project, that, some of the schoolyard taunts that were being shouted at me were things that were actually created as propaganda slogans in the 1940s. And, these things continue to live on in popular culture long after people even understand where that original iteration came from. So as we kind of peel back these layers and understand how long history communities like Japanese American, Chinese American, Filipino Americans who've been here for like 4 or 5 generations in some cases, we can see those narratives play out. But it also helps us understand what's happening right now, because a lot of the anti-immigrant narrative around, Muslim Americans, for example, or recently the call for eliminating H-1B visas. I mean, that's impacting contemporary Asian immigrants in a way that, other anti-Asian propaganda has in the past with racially restrictive immigration legislation. So it's kind of about calling out the negative propaganda and the negative representations, and also just better understanding them, so that when you're constructing a counter narrative, what are the things that we need to address? What kind of messages should Asian American filmmakers be creating in their craft to basically disprove these preconceived notions that people in the general public might have?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, and I think too, it's like, I think both of our organizations are trying to support media makers and storytellers that are coming from the Asian American community and from different communities, and that's a huge part of it is like our own access to be able to tell these stories and to be able to, you know, I guess, develop quote unquote counter narratives that just, you know, show us in different ways and in different lights. And I think, you know, when I think of what we're trying to do, to both exhibit and distribute those films, but then also to develop artists and filmmakers to figure out how to be able to tell these stories on the screen. That's like, you know, I think it goes back to your point about how like we never saw positive images of ourselves in mainstream culture or in mainstream media, and we know that so much of what gets put into mainstream culture and mainstream media ends up, you know, kind of like solidifying the way that people perceive or view conflict or other communities and things like that. And so, yeah, I'm super excited about this film festival because of that. Like we've curated, Rob has gone through and curated 55 different films that are all created by and from the community, you know, from the Japanese American community, and that in and of itself is the representation there for us to be able to tell our own stories is quite impactful. So Rob, I was going to pass it back over to you in the last few minutes that we have, and maybe broaden it out, because not only has Rob, you know, put this propaganda piece together, but he's also curated the entire virtual pilgrimage, like the whole 9 weeks. And so I wanted to also spend a few minutes to kind of chat through, you know, that process, that curation, why you think representation from Japanese American filmmakers and artists is so important.
Absolutely. And thanks for kind of setting us up to talk about this part of it, because I think, you know, a lot of the program in the film festival, while it does adhere pretty strongly to the weekly themes throughout the rest of the pilgrimage, we've also tried to kind of delve a little deeper into some of the conversations that we're having through the films themselves, and kind of create some discourse of nuance, right? And having an understanding that on any of these issues, there are multiple perspectives, even within our own community. Also, at this point, our community has been here in the United States for so long that, you know, at one point, certainly during the war years, it was, I think, a lot easier to kind of have a conversation around a dominant narrative within a Japanese American community, the Issei, the Nisei, the Sansei, etc. But now, you know, we have not only Shin Issei and Shin Nisei, right? Like folks who came after World War II that are contributing to these conversations. We also have a huge number of mixed race and multi-ethnic Japanese Americans that have their own unique perspectives. And, you know, looking at the resettlement, for example, we've got people who went back to the West Coast. We've got people who settled in regions where they were incarcerated. We have others who went somewhere completely different to the East Coast or the Midwest. It's just so much nuance and variety in all of these stories. And I think in some ways, as filmmakers or film curators, there's a cynicism around this idea that, you know, there's this camp genre of Japanese American filmmaking where, you know, you hit the same like 5 beats about the wartime hysteria, about the incarceration experience, about the redress. But it goes so much deeper than that. And I think we've tried to create a program that explores that teaches that history for people who might not know it, but at the same time delves into it with a much greater nuance than we've seen in any single film program in the past. So it's been a really exciting process, and I'm certainly grateful for the opportunity to be able to have these conversations and to be able to work with so many incredibly talented Japanese American filmmakers. It's one of those things where it's like, I think in the back of my head, in the decade or so that I've been doing film programming, I've had this kind of running list of Japanese American filmmakers who I've just come across in many different projects. And this is the first time where I've ever gotten a chance to actually dig up all of these contacts and say, you know, we're doing this thing and we'd love to show your work. And I mean, it's just been such a positive response, enthusiastic response from the filmmaking community, and certainly has been great to hear from the people who are watching the films and participating in these live discussions. So as we go from week to week, I hope that people continue to stay engaged in the film festival. We have several titles that will be available for the duration of 9 weeks, but many of them are only available during that week when we're featuring them. So definitely, if you're interested in watching some of those films that are coming in later weeks, make note of it on your calendar so that you don't miss the opportunity to see them while we have them on the website.
That's great. Yeah, and we'll be posting, in addition to having a new set of films each week available on the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimage website, we're also going to be adding a schedule for live Q&A events that will, I think, typically happen on Saturdays. So yeah, please look out for that too. Well, it is, in Chicago at least, it is 6:01, which probably means it's 7:01 on the East Coast, and whatever time it is, 4:01 on the West Coast, and I think that's our time. Rob, anything else that you wanted to add?
Just wanted to say, thanks again, Jason, for having this conversation. Really appreciate the work that you're doing in Chicago, and look forward to highlighting also one of the films that you worked on, The Orange Story, as part of our week discussion on resettlement. So for folks who haven't seen it, it's a really excellent film that kind of talks about this evacuation experience of an elderly Issei man. Yeah, definitely one of the more solid films. When we look at the subject matter, there's a lot of documentaries on Japanese American relocation and resettlement, but not so many that are about that are done in a scripted narrative format. So it's really fascinating, and I hope that we can have some more discussion into that topic in a later week.
Yeah, yeah. We got 9 weeks to go, so we'll pace it out and find some time to talk about scripted narratives in the process. Well, thank you everybody for joining. There's so much to do, and that, like, outside of just the film festival committee, there is so much to kind of like wrap your head around and engage with on the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimage's website. It's just an unbelievable team of folks who've come together to program like a fully robust 9-week all virtual program. So please hit the website, check it out, and Rob and I'll be back. Thank you very much.